All right, so we're going to take a look at some texturing, some shading, and some atmosphere. And we're going to create this render right here. I have a file that's pre-set up here. It's chapter 9, texturing, shading, start. This is basically where we left off earlier when we were doing the earlier height field lessons. I'm going to break this down. It's a couple things in here that I did slightly different. If I could jump to my scene view, basically we just have our height field. We have our paint, our mask, but we can actually get rid of these. I'm not actually using those anymore. So we just have our height field noise, our distortion, our micro distortions, our mask by feature. And basically what the mask by feature is doing is it's taking this noise that's clipped and then it's adding them on based on that mask. So basically anywhere it's slanty, make it really rough. Clearing that mask, I'm doing a bit of an erosion, and then this is basically where we left off. So I have it cached out. So basically you can just open up the file, start there, and then we'll get going. So to get started, we're going to drop in a height field visualization. So we've used this a lot in the past, and this is basically where a huge bulk of the shading comes into place. To give you, to kind of unpack the bigger picture workflow that I do most of the time when I'm doing terrains is I start by building a base color map based off of the attributes, the height, the debris, the water, all that kind of stuff. And then I essentially mix in actual texture information in the shader. Either like multiplications or mixing, adding, all those kind of operations. So we'll go over that right now. So I'll go ahead and drop in the visualize. So basically, instead of just making this up, I'm going to actually bring in inside of Houdini the reference file that I was using to recreate this terrain. So what I'm going to do is jump up to my object level. I'm going to drop down a grid. Scale this up to 250. I'm going to, we'll do 500 for the scale on that. Then what I'm going to do is just move this over right there. And what I'm going to do is drop it inside of here, and then I'm going to scale up the resolution to 100 and 100. And then what I'm going to do is attribute from map. And I have this texture that I've got. So under reference, I have this reference right there. I'm going to hit accept. I'm actually going to give this 1000 by 1000, and that's just me trying to make this as dense as possible so we can actually see everything. If I just go into W to the wireframe, now we can actually get the real pixel information. So now instead of trying to just make up, instead of just making up the color information, we can just use the reference that we're using right there. So I'm going to rotate that -90 so it's facing the same direction that we're looking. And now what I'm going to do is just jump into the terrain, the visualization, and then make sure that I'm on show all objects right there. I'm going to jump into my height field visualization and then exit out all of these right here. Just like that. I'll leave 2 of them there. So the first one, basically what we're going to do is we're going to grab something like down here, something dark. So I'll double click on that. Click the eyedropper and just select something right in there, and then exit out of that and go to the height field, go to the top of the height field right there, and then we'll select something bright, which is going to be right in there. Great, so now I have some sort of contrast, and you can see immediately we're already getting into that world. So I'll make sure I'll compute range, I'll go 0, and then we'll just do 390 just to make sure that we're getting all the information there. So we're already kind of in that world. And now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to start to use attributes to take this a step further. And what I'm going to do is just before we get into like all the custom attributes, just make one hero one from a mask. So I'll do height field mask by mask by feature. I'll drop that in. And we'll just do the slope. The slope is a great one that captures a lot of the features on the terrain. And what I'm going to do here is just pull this up right here. Just like that. Go somewhere in like right here. So I'm trying to, what I'm doing right now is I'm trying to capture the snow right there. Cool. So we'll start right there. I'm going to add a bunch of attributes on top of this. So we'll start with that. So we'll go ahead and go over here and we'll grab that mask layer right there. We'll grab a color white. So you can see we're starting to get to that direction right now. And then what we'll do is we'll grab the debris, make those white as well. Whoops. Just like that. And then we'll grab water, make that white as well. And this took a lot of experimentation. I've already done this ahead of time, so that's where I know these are going to work great, because that's what I was experimenting with the board before. But basically, as I do this stuff, I usually just go through here and just click on all of these and just kind of see what I get and see if it looks good. Cool. So I'm going to leave it like that. I was tweaking this a lot. If you guys want to keep playing around, adding more or less snow, I'm going to leave it right in the kind of, whenever I look at a terrain, I try to look at the percentages. There's probably, if we don't count this base right here, probably about 40 to 50% of it is covered in snow. And that's kind of where we're at right now. Cool. So from there, what we'll do is height field convert. I'll go ahead and bake point colors. And now what we'll do is we'll start to get into materials. So I'm going to do a couple different things. I'm going to jump into my camera. I'm going to disable my reference. I'm going to drop in a skylight. So I'm going to control click the skylight. That'll be like our default lighting setup. There's a couple settings in here that I'm going to do as we get going. So I'm just going to hit render just to see where we're at. And then I'm going to make sure that progressive rendering's on. After I hit render right here, our Mantra IPR node is going to get created by default. And then what I'm going to do is jump into the parameters right here, jump into rendering, change our rendering engine over to physically based rendering. That's the PBR rendering. So it's going to have like proper GI and all of that. A couple settings I'm going to tweak in here. I'm just going to go a little bit lower on my skylight. So a value of 25 right here, just to make my shadows a bit more elongated and exaggerated. And I'm going to go intensity up to 2. And then I'm going to make sure that I have my lookup table on. I already have it on, so yours is most likely looking like this. If you don't have this bar right here, just make sure you turn this on right there. And what I'm going to do is bring in a lookup table, and I've talked about this in all of my workshop tutorials. Basically what a lookup table does is it applies a photographic camera response curve or a glorified S curve to your render to get away from these really blown out highlights and the really crunchy, the really CG looking blacks. So I'll set this to 1. I'll go to right click, load LUT. I have a LUT in here already, so hip file under miscellaneous, and I'll grab that LUT right there. Great. So now what we can do is we can go really, really high on the exposure because it won't get blown out. So I'm just going to leave our intensity at 2 right there. Great. So we're going to jump into the terrain. I'm going to drop down I'm going to pause this for a second, and then what I'm going to do is drop down a material network. Whoops. Material network. And this is what we'll use to create our shader. So we'll drop down a principal shader. That's kind of like Mantra's default shader. We'll need to assign this to that object. So we'll come up here, we'll type in material. And what this node does is essentially assigns a material to our object. So I'll grab the material under material network, and we'll grab that principal shader. And at this point, if we just give this a render, we'll we'll see a couple different things of the base shader that we're going to want to tweak. By default, it's going to come out way too reflective, way too specular. So what we'll do is go ahead and we'll come down to under reflection, under reflectivity, we'll just set that to 0. And then up here, what we'll do is instead of using the point color and this value right here, we'll just make sure that this is going to be set to 1. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use a parameter. And this is how we're going to pull in our color values. So we can pull in a ton of different attributes. So using the parameter, we could do like CD. We'll have to make sure that we set our type correctly. So if we do like float, I'm just going to put this into my CD into base color right there. And if I give this a render, we'll see that after get it going. So we're going to make sure that we set the type to vector because color is a 3-way vector for red, green, and blue. Great. So now what we want to do is we want to actually start adding texture details to this. So what I'll do is I'll bring in a texture. So tab texture. I will navigate. I have one for us under texture right here. So the rock sharp. And what I'll do is just go ahead and plug this into base color. So we'll just preview it like that and we'll mix this in later. We'll need a couple different things. So I'll go ahead and just let this render. We'll need a couple different things from here. The tiling of this texture is going to be way too large. And we'll see that after this gets going. And to tile this in and Mantra, what we need is a couple different things. We'll grab the UV coordinates. So tab UV coordinates. And then we'll do a multiply constant. And then we'll plug in the UV into the value. We'll plug the scaled into the UV. And essentially, we'll be back to where we were. And then we'll bump this up to something like, we'll do something like 12. What we're looking for right now is not necessarily, this. If you look at this rock texture, it's pretty small comparatively to this terrain. But what we were looking for is just photographic details to put into this. At a distance, even micro textures can look pretty good on these terrains. Great. So we have our rock, we have our snow, we have our base mix that we want to do. Now we want to get in a bump map. So what I'm going to do is take the base color off. And I'm going to jump into my principal shader and go into bump and normals. And this is what we're going to use to get kind of micro details. So you can see it doesn't have the micro details into the geometry. It looks pretty gamey right now, very CG. So to make it look a bit more photographic, we'll go over to bump and normals. We'll do enable. We'll go to texture path and we'll go ahead and grab that same rock texture. And then what we'll do is we'll really crank this up. So I'll just hit render so we can see what this looks like. And we're starting to get some micro details. But what I'm going to do is really crank this up to something like 2000. That'll really start to make those things kind of stand out. Great. So we basically now we have all three of our different textures that we want to use. There are three different areas: our snow, our mixed color, our texture color, and then our bump color. So now what we want to do is actually mix these things together. So the workflow that we're going to do is first we're going to get our rock texture good to go. So we don't want to mix in the rock everywhere. We want to mix it onto the areas that essentially don't have snow. So we're going to use a mix for that. But before that, what we're going to do is we're going to multiply these two together. So we'll drop down and multiply. I'll do CD in here, and then we'll do color right there. And then we'll plug these two in. And what we'll notice that is everything is, at this point, the rock, we can't see it at all. It's just completely black. So what we need to do is actually remap this value so that the black values aren't getting so dark. So we'll do fit range for that. So tab fit range. We'll plug that in. We'll do source 0, destination, source max 1, well, then we'll do 0.5 for destination minimum. That'll essentially just lift it so that we can actually see the texture detail in there. Great, now we actually need to mix these together. And for that, what we're going to do is use a ramp and a mix. So we'll drop in a ramp parameter, and then we'll drop down a mix node. And the ramp parameter, what we're going to do is we're going to remap the color coming from our base color terrain. And what this is going to do is if we just invert this, basically we'll just get the reverse of what the snow is already given us. We'll have to crunch it. I'll go ahead and just preview this right now. Great, so we want to make sure that the blacks are already getting actually black. So we'll crunch that a little bit more. And great, so now we have something to mix onto, and we'll make sure that the rocks are all showing up right there. Great, so essentially the white areas is where the rock is going to show up. So we'll drop in the mix. This will be our bias. And then our CD is going to be our top parameter. Our rock is going to be our input 2. And then we're going to throw that into the blend color. And there we go. Great. So now what we want to do is just go ahead and add some atmosphere. And this is something that we haven't really done in any of the workshop tutorials yet. So this will be a little bit of new information. We are going to, we are planning on at the moment releasing an entire volume series where we do like clouds and a little bit of simulation. So this will be kind of like a little bit of a introduction before we get to that. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to create a volume box, and then that's going to have a volume density in it. So if I come over to my object view again, and what I'm going to do here is do geo. I'm going to jump in, I'm going to call this fog. I'm going to jump inside of here, and then what I'm going to do is throw it on a box. And what I'm going to do is just zoom in on this so we can see it a little bit better. And what we're going to do is we're going to make this size 10 in X, 5 in Y, and 10 in Z. And then what we're going to do is we're going to copy this parameter. So right click, copy Y, right click, and paste relative references onto the center Y, and then what we're going to do is divide by 2. And that's just going to make sure that it sits on the flat ground right there. Great. We can give some, make this a polygon mesh so we get some resolution. And then what we're going to do is use a VDB from polygons right there. And what this is going to do is convert it into a VDB. And a VDB is essentially a volume. So we'll go ahead and take off the distance, and we'll bring on the fog. So that's what's actually going to give us a volume object. And you can see as we go through here, it's actually a fog, which is going to be renderable. So we're going to want to make this to have a gradient so that it's going to be harsher at the bottom and less dense at the top. And you can kind of think about, if you done the Houdini randomization and scattering, how we can do that is we just use the height and we multiply it against the whatever attribute is creating this thick fog, and it's going to be right here, which is density. So what we'll do is we'll do volume VOP. And this is similar to a point VOP. Again, we haven't got into VOPs much in these series. So if these kind of go over your head, don't be scared. They can be intimidating at first. Again, we could potentially even have an entire Vex point VOP title on its own. So we have density going to density. So essentially we're doing nothing at this point. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the position Y, and we're going to multiply it against the density. So we'll do vector to float. So we're going from a vector variable right here to a float vector. We'll grab the position, and then we'll go ahead and multiply the Y multiply. We'll multiply the y value by the density value. And we're not getting exactly what we want because we're getting less at the bottom. So it's going from 0 to 5 up here. So it's actually making the top brighter and the bottom. So we want to reverse that. And we can do that by using a fit range. And we'll bring that over the y, the position y right there. And what we'll do is we'll do source min and source max is 0 and 5 because that's going to be our height value. And then what we're going to do is flip these 0 and 1 for the destination min and max. So now we have the height going from bottom to top. And if we go into our display settings down here, go over to our background and switch this over to dark. And we'll check off display environment lights as background. We'll be able to see this a little bit better. So good so far, but what we want to do is dive inside of here, and we're going to actually throw a color correction on here, and that's going to help us with again taking that gray value and slamming it down. So if we take this and go to gamma, which is again our gray value, so we're going to remap this value right there, and we're going to kind of slam it down just like that. And the value I'm going to leave off here with is 0.2. But before we do this, you can see we're getting a little bit of clipping. We don't want this to show up in the render, so we'll throw down a clamp. We'll put that before the color correct, and that'll kind of clamp any values going from above and below 0 and 1. And the next step, what we want is just to do the density multiplier. And I like to set up a, so we'll call this a gradient. And I like to do a different volume VOP for this. So I'll do volume VOP. I'll plug that in. And we'll just rename this to be density. And then all we have to do is throw down a multiply constant. Just like that. And this will just be a multiplier for how much fog we actually want. And we'll see that in the render. And then from there, what we want to do is just go back up to the parent node, go up here, and then we'll just scale this up to be 200. So that'll go over our entire scene just like that. We'll go over to our render again. I'll go ahead and save that. I'll jump onto my render view. And then I'll just hit render, see what we get. And what we should see right off the bat is this is going to be way too thick. Very, very dense. So to tone that down, we have that volume attribute. So we'll go down to the volume density, go to the volume multiplier. And then what we're going to do is set this down. We're going to go down like 0.01. We'll go 0.1. So we'll see a little bit more, 0.01. See even more than that. And then from there, what we'll do is just do 0.001, and that's the value that I left off with. And if you want to actually see this a little bit better, what we can do is just turn off our progressive rendering. And if we want to see this a little better, if we just click and drag up here, we'll be able to see that a little bit better. Great, so that's wrapping that up. Cool, so that's kind of like wrapping up the individual lessons. And what we're going to do next is we're going to start to take a look at the cover art. We're going to start looking at the cover art, and we're going to start building this from scratch.